Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Finance Committee meeting of November 21st, 2019. We will begin. We're going to shuffle the agenda around just a bit because we are waiting on the auditors to arrive to give their presentation. So we will go ahead and begin with item number 4, submission of the report on open positions.
Anybody have any questions?
Dana always asks why she has to sit through the whole meeting, so.
I can say the communications officer positions where we are, well, I think we're 6 down now, but we do have 2 that are this close to being filled and then 3 others that are in the pipeline, so it's looking better. I don't have to report unless you have any questions.
I suppose my only question would be, since these are all open positions, if we don't end the TIF and get our sales tax dollars back, and we'll be discussing that at item 2 in just a bit. What is the status of these positions? Would we just remove them since they are not filled?
They are on a hold right now. The ones that are going through are the ones that have we were already in the process, when we started looking at the smart freeze. So if it
Sorry,
doesn't,
can you speak up just a little bit?
sure, if it doesn't go as planned or whatever, then that will be up to the manager to decide which positions are critical, like communications officer positions, are. We have to have those versus some others that could be frozen for a long time or whatever the case may be. So we're doing real slow fill. We're not filling in the vacant ones that we haven't had people in the pipeline.
Okay, thank you. So just because things are unclear, and then should things not go according to plan, then it'll be up to our city manager to determine what positions are critical. Thank you. Councilmember Wilson?
What is the dollar amount that's assigned to those positions? Do we know?
I don't have a figure.
Does anybody know what dollar amount we have pending and open positions? Okay. Is there a way we can get that number?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions from council? No? Lovely. We can move to Mr. Francisco, item 3, would that be best?
Yes.
Okay, we're just moving backwards. Go ahead.
Okay, so, and I will apologize, in your packet, what looked to be item 2 is actually item 3. So the monthly revenue reports that you see and that you receive every month are included into your packet. As you see, the general fund,
I'm sorry, which one are we doing?
Councilmember,
Two or three?
so item 3?
where it says item 2, potential budget
That's
reductions,
what we're gonna do.
the next page after that is the start of the handouts for page 3, for item 3.
Yeah.
And these are the monthly revenue and expenditure reports that you get every month.
It's after page 120, after there. Okay.
I would point out that general fund revenues are now 4.62% below budget for this fiscal year. Again, that is primarily because of the 6.9% that we are below projection for sales tax. The capital projects reflect the same sort of thing, about 6% below budget, and that is because of their continued apportionment to the TIF fund. And then, of course, if you move down and look at the TIF fund, it's the sales tax to the TIF fund on page 2 there is 100% above target. So we'll continue to monitor that and take whatever actions council directs related to that. That's really all that I had related to the revenue and expenditure report. I'll be glad to respond to questions that you may have.
Councilmember Wilson, did you have a question?
I do. There's 1.1 million collected to date in sales tax. I showed collected to date on your page 2
In the TIF
in
fund?
the TIF fund.
Yes.
1.1 million.
Yeah, now that's actually, we did not apportion the October apportionment, so it'd be a little bit more than that, actually. But yeah, that was as of the end of September, actually.
Councilmember Holman, did you have a question?
Yeah, so on this form that shows the year-to-date so far, the comparison between Norman and other cities in the metro and the state. I noticed we started off July and August negative, but we've had 3 straight months of positive, but we are still, as of November, the lowest of all these cities at 1.4% or 1.40%. And it looks like Moore is right along with us. Do you think this is, and I noticed that Edmond is almost 7% up, and they've had months,
Stephen, what page are you on?
there's no number on the page.
It's almost
It's
toward the
the,
back.
like the third one from the back, or second one from the back.
Wow.
They've had some months. They had 1 month where they had, well, this month they had 11.15% growth from last year, November. Is there any kind of trends that are going on in the South Metro that are different from the North that you know of that would reflect why Norman and Moore are seeing a seemingly slow sales tax?
Well, one thing that and this is just anecdotal, but I don't know what it's called, but the development at Memorial Road and Western, where the Costco is, and they've opened up a lot of new businesses in that area that have drawn a lot of business to that area. So I would suspect that that's the big thing that's related to Oklahoma City's. I can't really say related to Edmond, except that Edmond is smaller, so any individual business that opens in Edmond can move the needle a lot more in Edmond than it would in Oklahoma City or Norman. But that's just anecdotal, so.
Thank you.
Any further questions from council at this time? I'll just ask again, so we are 4.6% negative, is that correct?
For the general fund as a whole, yes.
Okay, for the general fund as a whole, and that is due to the continued apportionment of sales tax dollars into the UMP TIF fund, correct?
That's the largest factor, yes.
Thank you. So with seeing no further questions from council, we can, I believe, oh, yes, Councilmember Patron?
So are we skipping all of these pages? We're just gonna do that paragraph and what Councilmember Holman brought up?
Whatever you'd like to, any
Whatever you'd
questions?
like to
Anything else is like
discuss.
worth looking at?
Where's the list of furlough names?
The list of,
Furlough names? I don't know, the mayor seems to have a list of names that people are gonna be furloughed.
Okay, well, so we'll get to that in item 2, actually. I believe that
there's
is,
an item?
there'll be item 2 when we discuss budget reductions, potential budget
That's what I
reductions.
thought we were on.
No, we are on item 3, so, but this, yeah. So we are going to, if there are no further questions.
3 is 2, 2 is 3.
No, item 2 is still the discussion of potential budget reductions, but item 3 is what we just went through. But there, okay,
All
cool.
right.
Any further questions from council?
Maybe later, once I get through all this stuff.
I know,
Okay.
right?
So, well, while that happens, I believe our auditors have stepped in, is that correct?
Yes.
So, with them being here, we can revert back to item 1, and I will go ahead and turn it over back to our finance director, Anthony Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will introduce first Clint Mercer, our chief accountant. And he has done the yeoman's work along with his staff to prepare our annual audit for the fiscal year that ended June 30th of 2019. You'll recall that at the September Finance Committee meeting, we gave the Finance Committee, which by the way is also the city's audit committee, we gave you preliminary information on the figures for the fiscal year end that we had turned over to the auditors. And now the auditors have done their work and they're presenting the final audited figures for you that will be in your December council packet. But basically all that will change between now and then is that we'll put the cover letters on and the fancy covers and bind the document. But as far as all the figures are concerned, this is pretty near final. So I'll ask Clint to introduce our auditors from the firm of BKD and let them delve into the report as deeply as they may choose.
This is Joel Hosser. And this is Kirsty Houston.
Yes.
Yep, okay, thank you very much. I know there's quite a few new faces on the committee, so some of this is, we could go into all kinds of detail, or we could keep it fairly brief. I'll give you the high points, which is probably what we want to do, but at any time, if anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. As Clint said, we're wrapping up the financial statement audit. We begin usually in the summertime with some of our planning procedures, usually around July timeframe, and then we come out to do final field work usually at the beginning of October. So we're wrapping it up. It's been through a first review, the financial statements have, and now on our end, we do a secondary review by somebody that's not part of the audit engagement team. It's part of our independence requirements and regulations, and so she is scheduled to pick this up on Monday and begin her final review, and so we should be able to issue by the city council meeting prior, so they're in the final packets. But real briefly, the CAFR, which is the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report that the city's finance department puts together, is, as you can see, a very large document that takes a lot of work and a lot of time to put together. There's probably 200 to 300 cities across the U.S. that actually put together an entire comprehensive annual financial report, and the city's one of them. They received an award from the GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, which is a national, the national association of city and county governments throughout the U.S. And so a lot of information is in here. What I usually start with, if I'm telling anybody about these financial statements, is if you don't look at anything other than one thing, look at the management's discussion and analysis. That's usually at the very beginning of the financial statements, and what it'll do is it'll give you the highlights of what happened throughout the year financially. It's got condensed tables of all the financial statements that you really need to see, and at least spend some time reading that, and it'll give you a good overview. After that, a lot more set of financial statements. You really have about 3 different sets. One of them, the first one, we call the government-wide financial statements, and it is what you would see in a traditional business. We call that full accrual, which is you record accounts receivables, you record accounts payables, any kind of liabilities. So if you're used to looking at company financial statements, that's what you would typically see. The next section that you would go into, we call the fund financial statements. And I know that's what the committee and Anthony spend a lot of time doing, usually the government-wide. And would it be helpful if I gave you all page numbers?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
The government-wide begins on page 17 of the financial statements. And these, again, are what you would typically see in a commercial-type organization, full accrual. Everything's measured consistently with that. Go to the next page, which is page 19. 2 page 19s, we'll get that fixed. And those are the fund financial statements. So if everybody can turn to page 19. These are probably second to the MD&A, Management Assessment Analysis, is an important set of financial statements to look at. And what these do is these break out the government-wide financial statements into the funds. Everybody has a general fund. You hear a lot of that spoken around. How's the general fund look? That's where this comes from. And probably the most important number in the entire set of financial statements to look at is there's called an unassigned fund balance on second page of 19 in the general fund. That has a total of $13,223,749. Which is very healthy. If that number is in the negative, then there's usually a problem, a pretty big one. But the city has consistently increased that over the years, which is really good news. With that, we'll turn to the next set, which is page 21 of the financial statements. And these are also fund financial statements, but these are related to your utility type departments. So water, sewer, sanitation, this is where they all show up. And these statements, again, are full accrual like you would see when a traditional business to look at. And then from there, on page 26, you will see a set of the notes to these financial statements, which goes on forever, to about page
This is the
70.
first part that I read in it carefully, but I'm a weird guy. So.
Yeah, if you ever can't sleep at night, just pull up the footnotes and you'll be pretty well knocked out. These are just explanations of kind of what is in the financial statements. And again, footnotes, what I would tell you probably is the most important to look at would be the pension plans. So there's always talk, and you might hear in the news a lot about pension plans and unfunded liabilities and how are these going to get covered. Those are pretty important footnotes to look at. The city participates really in the state's pension plans. Those are administered by the state of Oklahoma, and so there's not a lot of say of what goes on from a funding standpoint in those plans. But those I'll look at, and then afterwards. Most of those financial statements are just details of some of those first columns that you looked at, and you could go through those to see in even more detail what was in there. But those are the financial statements very quickly. So on our side, from the auditor standpoint, what we do is we go through the entire report. We call tick and tie and make sure the balances agree to where they're supposed to agree. And then at the end of it, we'll issue an opinion on those financial statements, actually several opinions, but the main opinion is classified into 3 levels. You have unmodified opinions, qualified opinions, and adverse opinions, which essentially an adverse opinion is no opinion. It basically says that you can't audit them. As we've done for many years now, we're anticipating issuing an unmodified opinion, which is a clean opinion that there's no significant issues to discuss. If we were to find serious issues that we needed to bring to the Finance Committee, those would be called significant deficiencies or material weaknesses. And those would tell you basically that there are areas in the financial statements that could be materially misstated, but we don't have any of those to bring to you this year. And so anticipate issuing a clean opinion with no written comments. And with that, I will
Councilmember
open
Hall?
it up.
I was just appointed in September,
Okay.
so I'm one of the new faces at the table.
Okay.
So
Well, welcome.
got a lot to learn. So on the first page, on page 1, or I'm sorry, page 4,
Yes.
in the third bulleted point, it talks about approximately 8% or 13.223,749 million was unassigned at the end of the fiscal year.
Correct.
Okay, and then the next bullet point, it says at the end of the current fiscal year, the unassigned fund balance for the general fund was that same dollar amount, or 18% of the total general fund expenditures. What is the difference in the percentages?
Very good question. So the first bullet point, the way fund financial statements work is so the way I like to explain it is when you look at financial statements, you have assets, liabilities, and then you have what is called a fund balance. So an asset is really what you have in your possession. A liability is what you owe to somebody, and then the residual is the fund balance. That's kind of what you have in possession. And so what we do typically, that some of the measurements that you would look at is that the fund balance is split into 5 different levels. Some is restricted, so you can't use it for anything except for those restricted purposes. Some of it they'll say is non-spendable. That's usually your inventory, stuff that you can't turn over to cash very quickly. You have committed amounts, and committed amounts are those that are put in place by city council, and only city council can uncommit those resources. They're not technically restricted because restricted comes from somebody outside the city. Then you'll have an unassigned balance, which is those that typically have been kind of what I'd call appropriated to an extent for another year, or in some cities, a finance director is allowed to commit certain funds, but the city council could overrule that. Those get a little bit complicated. And then at the end of it, you have what's unassigned. And a lot of people that look at financial statements will focus on that unassigned number. Again, if it's negative, very bad. And what they usually use are these key measurements. So the first one is basically telling you that 8% of your entire fund balance is unassigned. So 13 million of all of your balance is unassigned. Typically
Okay.
that's a pretty high number. The next one, another key measure that they look at is the percentage of your fund balance compared to your general fund expenditures for the year. And typically those are, a good number is take your total expenditures divided by 12 and you want 2 months worth of reserve in your unassigned fund balance, that's one of the measurements that they use a lot of times to look at.
Thank you. Councilmember Wilson?
Thank you.
So, are you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Anthony, of that 13 million that's unassigned fund balance, what part of that is at the council's discretion, and where is the rest of it allocated in the budget?
Well, all of it is at the council's discretion to some extent, but a lot of it is accruals in the sense that the money has not come in yet. So while it can be booked on the balance sheet, it is for the most part accrued sales tax. As you know, that sales tax is collected at a business today, and we don't receive the money for as many as 75 days into the future.
So this is
But it can,
anticipatory?
but some of it, a large part of it. And that's by definition what accruals are. So you can't spend it today, but you can book it on the balance sheet because it reflects the health of the city at that given point in time. So how much of it is at the discretion of the council? All of it. But how much can you spend today is what we, on a cash basis, report to council.
How much can we spend today?
That's the roughly $3 million figure that we reported to you.
Okay, thank you.
And,
Councilmember Patron?
and you said 75 days from now, so does that,
As much as.
today is 3 million, and 75 days from now is,
No, because remember, during those 75 days, you're spending some of that money and some more money is coming in.
okay, so what changes 75 days from now that you were talking about versus the 3 million that she said today?
Well, it's a rolling 75 days, if you will. I don't want to confuse the matter, but just remember that an audit is taking a snapshot of the financial health of the city at a given point in time. In this case, June the 30th, okay? So when I say accrued revenues on June the 30th, some businesses throughout Norman had collected some sales tax on that day and turned it over to the state tax commission the next day, okay? But we know how much that was, or we can estimate how much that will be and book it on the balance sheet. But the state tax commission receives that information from the individual businesses. They aggregate all of that information over the next up to 75 days before they pay it over to the city. So when I say up to 75 days, if the business collected the sales tax on the 30th, it can be as few as 40 days. But if the business collected the sales tax on the 1st of the month, it can be 75 days. So I'm trying to explain accruals, and it's a confusing concept.
It is
Right, I
very
mean, I guess what I'm getting at is the snapshot being this time of year, Black Friday,
No, the snapshot is June 30th.
okay.
Yeah, this
So-
is very historical.
Yeah.
That's part of the problem is we look at this as a historical. If you're budgeting and trying to manage cash, you can't really rely on these to do
Okay.
that.
Yeah, that's the slowest time of year for the city.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any further questions from council? Okay. You all ready to, Councilmember Hall?
Just a second.
Okay, don't worry, we'll wait. Do you have a question? Go ahead, Councilmember Patron.
A council member that's not here had the following questions. She says on page 14, expenditures, and we may have just done this, expenditures are below expectations of 6.9% fund balance, higher than budgeted by 6.2%. Does this mean we spend 6.9 million less this year than we expected to? And that fund balance has 6.2 million extra cushion that we did not incorporate into this year's budget? If not, what does this mean, not just in audit terms, but in how much more cash we started this fiscal year with than we thought we did?
And without looking at the precise area that you're looking at, I don't know where those words are, but
Page 14.
when we reported to council where we predicted the closing position of the general fund in particular to be as of June the 30th, when we came to you in September, Yes, we said that we had about $3 million more than we had projected to have in the fund balance. We also pointed out that the council had committed to additional public transit expenditures that were going to be projected to draw that down in this fiscal year.
How
Okay.
does that change with the?
Sorry, I
That
think
has not
Councilmember
changed. There's
Hall had
still
a question in the queue. Councilmember Wilson.
Is it related to this little thread right here? Because mine's different.
Mine is related to that.
Okay,
but
go
I
ahead.
don't wanna step on your toes.
Go ahead.
Councilmember Wilson.
So how does that relate to where we are right now? That
We're
$3 million?
we're still very much at the same place, but just remember that,
Thanks, we're on target.
Even with our transit vote?
no, yes, remember
Because
that
of that transit vote?
because of the transit vote,
So am
If
I
we will-
hearing you say there's an extra $3 million in the general fund?
No.
Balance? No.
I'm telling you that we told you in September that we had an extra $3 million above what we projected,
But we used it.
but we
for
used
transit.
it for public transit.
And with that transit
And
vote.
because of the public transit vote, we won't be in a bad position next year. But remember that we don't get any revenues from the public transit sales tax until June.
Right.
So this fiscal year is where we thought we would be in September.
Great question. Are you ready?
Yeah,
Councilmember
thank you.
Hall.
So on page 8, and this actually might be more for you, Mr. Francisco, the second bullet point at the bottom, the use tax revenue has increased 2 million or 4.1% over the prior fiscal year. The city continues to benefit from agreements states have made with online retailers such as Amazon to pay the use tax. Are there any other options open there, or are we pursuing any other avenues of additional use tax other than what's been stated here?
Yes, we, being the City of Norman, the Oklahoma Municipal League, the Oklahoma Tax Commission, because Oklahoma is so dependent on sales tax, more so than any other state in the country, we are in the forefront of the efforts to better enforce the sales tax statutes that are in place. And where we are doing a better job of collecting a use tax that reflects here, that is going to slow down, because where we have had improvements, it has been primarily related to a judicial change. In the case of South Dakota versus Wayfair, there was a judicial change where the nexus for retailers to have to collect sales tax and remit it to wherever they were delivering their goods was changed judicially in that case. And that's where this big bump happened, okay? But there was a big old loophole in that case, in that retailers who sell less than $100,000 worth of goods in any given state don't have to collect the sales tax and remit it to wherever they are selling their goods. That is a legislative change that needs to happen in Congress. And that's where we continue to lobby, for lack of a better term, for the passage of federal legislation, the Remote Transaction Parity Act or the Marketplace Fairness Act, that would change the law for all retailers to have to collect sales tax and remit it to wherever they're selling their goods.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilmember Patron, you had a question?
Thank you. Okay, this one was, she asks, what does our excellent bond rating mean in terms of our ability to leverage creative solutions to short-term budgetary problems, such as the issuance of revenue bonds to supplement the construction projects that we anticipate will have a side benefit of bringing more sales tax revenue to Norman? Would that be a possible solution to a short-term budget shortfall to cover? What kinds of solutions would you offer to a client facing something like that?
But usually ours is to go to the finance director and discuss that. Because we don't understand what the city's going through enough to be able to say this is a good option. But yeah, short-term debt is usually a pretty, it has its goods and its bads. Usually you can issue short-term bonds, but absent of state law, it's typically not a good decision because you've got to get those things paid back. And you would have to get the city attorney involved because I'm not quite sure if you can issue bonds for operations. Typically, you've got to issue debt for a fixed capital asset,
Like a revenue bond that she's talking about here?
Typically, yes, it would have to be used for some kind of capital project.
Right.
But yeah, that's going to have to come from council and inside the city to make those determinations.
And our bond rating makes that,
You have a good
Is that-
bond rating, yes.
what would the interest rates be competitively right now for that kind of bond rating?
Yeah, especially with LIBOR falling out. Anthony, you may have a better sense of what those would be, but
Depends on the term of the bonds, but remember that that bond rating that you see is for general obligation bonds that have to be voted on by the people.
Okay.
yeah.
Great questions. Thank you. Any further questions from council regarding item 1, the audit? Yes, Councilmember Hall?
On page 14, under the, let's see, kind of in the middle of the page, the bullet point that starts with general fund, the statement about fines and forfeitures were below expectations by about $950,000, the most significant being within the bad debt category due to writing off uncollectible court receivables. Can you expand on that a little bit and why we can't do something else?
And I'll pass that to Anthony because
Okay.
he'll know the numbers in way more
Yeah,
detail.
that's kind of an annual, where we do a pretty good job of collecting on outstanding receivables, not just for courts, but citywide. But there are, in a college town like Norman, a lot of people who, come to a football game, get a parking ticket, and then they go away. And it's very hard to catch up with them. And so over a period of years, that can, roll up to several $100,000 that you have to write off in any given point in time because they have become so uncollectible that, you just write them off, so.
Is that a number that, is that
Yeah, you'd
the
see a
kind of number
similar-
you see similarly every year?
Yeah.
That's what we're writing off every year?
Yes.
Okay.
The write-off part of that, we've had a reduction in the amount of citations in general, but the amount that's been written off is pretty consistent year to year.
Any further questions from council?
Glad the
Regarding
forfeitures are down.
Item 1 on the agenda?
People keep their property.
No? Well, thank you. Thank you so
Thank
very
you.
much for your presentation and for putting all this together. We appreciate your hard work, yours and all of our staff, and thank you guys very so much. Very so much. So very much. Okay, so we will now move on to item 2. I believe our finance director may have some handouts for council. So, and going forward, we have a couple of options on how we would like to discuss this item. And I believe we will obviously want to discuss it since it is possible potential reductions to our budget and what that means. So as you will see on the handout, there are many items here totaling and up to almost, thank you, I have one. Do you have one? Totaling to almost $6 million. I believe Mr. Francisco can explain how some of these will be more difficult than others. But we have a couple of options. We can discuss these at length, or if for some reason, again, things do not go according to plan next Tuesday and we do not end the University North Park TIF increment and our sales tax dollars do not return to our general fund, then we could just leave it up to our city manager to decide which staff positions need to be cut and how to make these decisions best. So would you like to,
And if I can kind of
before,
provide
sorry,
a,
Wilson and Patron, and then, but if you'd like to go first.
you bet, just to kind of set the table. The conversation that took place at the initial TIF action item before council, when that was continued until November 26th, I sent out an email to staff and said, here's what I see in terms of our ability to provide council with information on potential solutions if the sales tax increment does not get returned to the general fund. And kind of painted the picture for how I thought it would be easily represented. And lo and behold, staff said, that's kind of what we put together during the initial budget conversation back in May. And I thought, well, we're all thinking the same way. So staff went back to the original document distributed to council during May's budget workshops when we were literally having the same conversation about the same potential impact on the general fund. So this document may look familiar in form and format. It's been updated and touched to account for some of the action items that did take place, and then a couple of minor modifications from what was originally presented to council back in May to what we think would be viable bundles of services that council could consider acting upon. There is an additional puzzle piece that was not on the table in May of 2019, and that was a conversation that happened when the hospital brought forth a request to issue debt. We knew we were under lease with the hospital to the tune of about 7.5 acres, and the question was posed, in their efforts long-term, does it make sense to sell them the real property under the Porter campus and clean up the map substantially? We had records that indicated we owned something closer to 12 acres than 7.5, but weren't sure why the lease was only on the 7.5. Through an appraisal that the hospital initiated to appraise the leased land, the 7.5 acres, came up with an appraised value of $3.8 million. We shared our records with the auditor, and it's an auditor we've used on several occasions for right-of-way acquisitions and real property acquisitions, and said, would you help us find how many acres we really have? There's a discrepancy between what we lease and what our records show we own. That information came back yesterday, and I'll ask Ms. Walker to share that communication, so it's not, I would just be a middleman in that conversation.
Sure, thank you. So we had with the original lease from many, many years ago that was renewed in June, 7.3 acres. After that lease was done, several streets and public rights-of-way were vacated, and so the leased property grew to a little over 9 acres. The city owns an additional 2.57 acres that's not part of the lease, so the total's around 11.66 acres. In my conversations with the appraiser yesterday, he's reworked the value, looking at all of the property and knowing what we know about the closed rights-of-way, and he believes the value to be $5.08 million for all of the city-owned property.
So as Mr. Split indicated at the last action item, council approving their debt issuance going forward, that he had received information from his board to enter into negotiations with the city for that acquisition as part of that debt issuance. So that was a puzzle piece you did not have available to you then that you have now, along with the balance of the information.
Councilmember Wilson?
So, assuming that we'll get some portion of that, what do you feel the time frame might be for that money to come in? And will that be in a time to kind of save this year's budget, knowing that no matter what happens on Tuesday, we will either have the money in there or we will have the ending of the TIF next year?
In most circumstances, our city attorney does serve as our real estate agent. So that's a wonderful thing, just to have a city attorney in-house to get that process through the system as efficiently as possible. We would be working on updated legal descriptions, so the thing to be sold, the 11.661 acres. Escrow should not be very lengthy. There's no debt attached to that real property. Catherine, an estimate on how long you think it would take to get from a green light from council to enter into the purchase and sales agreement with the hospital to close of escrow and funds in hand?
I would say 90 days max. I mean, we have to negotiate the final agreement, bring that forward to council for approval. They'll have to get their board to approve it, and then we'll go through the closing process, which is 4 to 6 weeks at the most.
90 days from when?
The day you tell us to
Green light.
start that
Green
work
light.
with the hospital.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm going to come to Patron, Paul, and then Councilmember Wilson. Do you have another question?
I might have a more detailed question later, but I was wondering if this is like, I have great vision and this is the smallest
I don't,
typeface
and I
ever. Is it possible to put it up there or something?
No, actually, the reason it's on paper is that it would not show up well there. This is, now, we could go to multiple pages, but we will start best to.
Would you like to go through each one?
I mean, well, for one, I can't read anything in the green, the red.
The green things have been done, so it's really not.
So they're not included. These are the positions that we're not funding already.
Okay,
Like
so
the
maybe then we
auditor.
could just do the,
Yeah, just for
Which
information,
parts-
if you wanted to go through one by one, the green things have been done, so you really shouldn't be under consideration. The
Okay.
things that are in yellow involve personnel reductions. The things that are highlighted kind of in pink are the things that would require union negotiations to implement.
And then,
and then my other follow-up question with that was, the list that you advanced to Mayor at the union meeting last night of personnel cuts that she announced would be coming down the pike. Could you give the rest of the council members that list?
That's
this is
this.
what you're looking at.
Yeah, this is the only list,
So
so
there's no list of names.
Oh, so
like
we
you
didn't
said.
we would
Actually
never.
have the authority to go and
Yeah, we
say
would
these
never
people
do
are getting fired?
names. Yeah, no, we,
Is it customary for the mayor?
Sorry,
to go
so
to
we
the-
had Councilmember Hall and then Councilmember Wilson.
Is it customary for
Councilmember
the
Hall, if you'd
mayor
like to go ahead.
to a AFSCME meeting to talk about positions?
I have absolutely no history on what would be usual and customary.
Just curious.
I believe that she was invited. Do we have any AFSCME members here who would know? Yes? You invited her? Thank you for clearing that up for us. Councilmember Hall?
I want to go back to Ms. Walker, and just to make sure I understand the 90-day process. So, the Norman Regional Health Authority did approve to approve selling or purchasing our, at first it was the 7.3 acres, and then it was my understanding that it was also approval to include, if the other extra acres came along, that they approved the purchase of whatever the city could identify, right?
I believe the agenda item the hospital considered was approval to enter into negotiations with the city.
Okay, so that's why it would go back to their board after we had an agreement to enter into. Okay, just want to make sure I understood the process. Thank you.
And I just want to go ahead and clear up a little bit because of the questions that took place before Councilmember Hall. Since the audience does not have a copy of this, but there are positions on here, the sustainability coordinator position. There's others, some maintenance workers positions, the part-time parking officer, and so those are listed right here as well. And then as you'll see, at the bottom, the ones that would have to be negotiated as well by the union. And so Councilmember Patron, you have another question?
Yes, so there are 3 lines that are particular to the union. And, but all in all, this whole thing would, if all of these things happen, it's like twice as many cuts as even the budget hole that we're talking about. Is that correct? So why would we,
No. Sorry.
No,
Yeah, I think Mr. Francisco should
why
probably
would we
answer.
suggest that we make 8.5 million in cuts?
I don't think that we would. The exercise that was done back in May was
This gives us choices.
to give choices. If we had the budget hole projected in April actually. And what would you do to reduce on the expenditure side? And the departments came forward with this list. One of the other options was to stop apportioning sales tax to the TIF and to do the things that were done in green. And that was what was ultimately done when we adopted the budget, was to do these things that were done in green and to make the projection that we would stop apportioning sales tax in July.
So we do have options. And does this cover also all of fiscal year 2020, or is it also fiscal, does it move into December of 2021?
She's very
No, this assumes, this would have assumed,
Because I couldn't hear.
Sorry, I know there was some chatter, and I'm sure that other people couldn't hear. So does this list here cover only the rest of fiscal year 2020, or would it also cover up to the end of December, whenever the TIF would end naturally?
most of these would be annual savings to the budget, each fiscal year, not related to the TIF.
Okay.
So,
annual savings.
and just to clarify on that point, as this list is larger than the whole, when the initial conversation took place in May, anticipated that should council go to the list, that the savings would be recognized for 12 months. And at a conversation in November, we would recognize those savings for only 6 months because half of this money has or will have been spent over the next handful of weeks. So the benefits of this list are now reduced for the current fiscal year. Their impact for next fiscal year would be full force.
Also, okay. Councilmember Wilson?
So, what I'm hearing is that we have a potential one-time funding of maybe $5-ish million from the sale of the hospital, which I do not ever propose using as a reoccurring, to cover positions, salaried positions. But in the predicament that we were in, where we were anticipating a good faith negotiation on the part of our partners out there for the UNP TIF, if we don't love that deal and we don't, as a council, want to pass that deal, we have a potential $5.8 million to get us through until we're whole next year, whenever the TIF ends naturally, because it's fully funded. Am I correct?
Yes, that's one option you could consider.
Okay, and then I heard the auditors say that we have $13 million worth of fund balances, which I understand that's a point in time. It's not necessarily reflective of what we actually have. We have some discretionary spending in there, though. Am I correct?
But
In
you
some
have
fund
taken
balances?
that discretion to fund the public transit system this fiscal year.
Well, but is there any
Rainy day.
fund balance, rainy day, anything that we could tap into? Say, for instance, we didn't get this money from the hospital.
You could appropriate funds out of the rainy day fund after the general fund balance has been drawn down below 1% of expenditures and you have spent the 2% emergency allocation. So
So the 2% emergency allocation gets spent, what triggers that?
spending it.
Okay, I like that. So here's my real
It's
question.
anticipated it would only be spent when we have to hire the contractors to do debris removal and that sort of thing, and a tornado has come through, that sort
We
of
can only
thing.
use it for those kinds of things?
No.
No? Okay.
If the city manager decided to spend it, the city manager could spend it.
Okay, so
How much is that?
how much is that now? Good question. I got more questions.
700,000
That goes along
roughly.
with this, so. But while you're looking that up, let me say, would it be prudent to cut positions, other than maybe not hiring unnecessary new positions or holding off on hiring some folks? Would it be prudent to cut positions of an organization this lean with that kind of money sitting there? $5.8 million. We have however many millions of dollars sitting in a TIF account, which I know we can't use, however, and then a fund balance. Would that be prudent to do that?
Well, from an operational perspective, when we look at several of the positions and the levels of service indicated, our internal struggle was that with a public safety sales tax, how comfortable are we reducing the current general fund contribution in the area of public safety? That's a tough pill to swallow because the voters have approved their portion, and the feeling we really need to keep our current investment level in public safety right up there. We look at Parks and Recreation, and in a generic nationwide kind of a vanilla conversation, general funds lean, who's going to get cut? They look at Parks and Rec. We're adding $100+ million in recreation and parks facilities. That's a tough pill to swallow. You're adding acreage and buildings. Would you want to reduce services in those mow them less frequently and maintain the buildings to a lower standard and provide fewer services? That one's a real tough pill to swallow. When we talk about street maintenance, we thought it's how do you reduce your street maintenance crew when the voters have just approved a roads bond for us because they've said roads are a high priority for us. That's a challenge. We look at community development and recognize their services are paid for by the development community they serve. The level of development hasn't slowed down, so the demand for the service hasn't gone down. That revenue stream really hasn't declined. That's a tough pill to swallow. So all of the easy decisions have all been made in prior years, and as Mr. Francisco had said, difficult decisions are the only ones we have left. So we recognize that each one of these recommendations comes with a reduction in the level of service we currently provide our community, and nobody on staff looks forward to that.
I know, and I think we all understand what cutting jobs means. What I'm saying is if we have $5 million plus a a fund balance, do we go there? When we know that the TIF is ending, for sure, it's fully funded next year.
That is quite literally the poker hand that council holds right now. Anybody can debate what is the right answer or the wrong answer.
Well, you've
They're all
managed
poker
many,
hands.
many cities with big, big budgets. Would you have done that in another city?
I would say that the actions council took in May to avoid layoffs was absolutely the decision to make, recognizing the level of expectation our community has and the level of service we provide. And I think, last resort, reduce the level
resort.
of service to your community.
So right before Christmas is not a great time to go telling everybody we're gonna cut if we don't get our way.
Never a
Okay,
good
that's all
time
you
to
Okay,
lay
Councilmember
off.
Holman?
So I do have a lot of concern about drawing the general fund down and reserves and rainy day fund. We've had storm events in this city in the last decade that have been severe and cost millions of dollars. If we were to draw that down and we have a major storm in May, what will we do?
The reason that you build fund balances in a rainy day fund is to be in a position to respond to that eventuality. You wouldn't have that ability. I mean, I'm at a loss. I really don't know what you do.
And there are a lot of other issues you've mentioned in the city that need funding that sale of hospital land are needed for, correct?
Yes, sir. That's what we talked about at the capital budget meeting Tuesday. That yes, there's a whole list of capital projects that have either been approved by the voters or have a high priority amongst council that need additional funds to complete at the level that we want to complete them. So yes, that was what was discussed. If there were going to be some proceeds of land sales, that you would apply them to those one-time capital needs.
Well, I personally feel, I really dislike the idea of drawing down all those funds. And I don't like the idea of using funds from land that we've owned since 1946 to fill a one-year budget gap. That's my personal opinion about the hospital funds.
Great questions. Councilmember Patron?
Okay, we also haven't discussed the minor amendment that would, a 5% immediately, that we have unilateral right to pull from the UNP TIF, and that would bring in $1.7 million into, after the split, I think ours is around, I don't remember exactly, 1.7 to 2.
1.3 or something?
1.7 to 2, I think. Anyway, so how would that, I can't again read what this whole green, like if we weren't to hire right away, the
Those are
ones
already
that,
done. The ones in green are already done.
or the like to haves or whatever, I can't read
Those are the
that,
like to haves, yeah.
what that
The
total
ones in
is.
green are the things that have already been done.
Okay, which one's the like to haves?
Like the ones in greens they're not included in the budget, so that you're on track.
I can't hardly even read this, but
The
anyway.
auditor,
So how
auditor
would,
tech.
would that be, and then of course, if we did that, then the TIF would end on its own in March. So we
No, it
wouldn't
would not.
be,
See, that's,
because you've
the-
taken the December 2020 maturation date, and when you take out 5% of the project cost, well, then you have it maturing.
in that scenario, you would reduce the authorized projects from $54.7 million to $52 million. And so the gap would be reduced from $8 million to $6.7 million. But you would still have to continue apportioning taxes to raise that $6.7 million. So that would be more like October instead of December, or maybe September instead of December. But we still have to apportion sales taxes for all of this fiscal year. And so we would still have to confront the $3.5 million gap this fiscal year. That's the problem.
Okay, and if we were to remove the cultural facility from the project plan, does that immediately end the increment as well by maturation?
Only if we are,
Your legal arguments aside.
Well, the legal argument is the argument, though,
Well,
because
it
the
is their
legal
argument.
argument,
I'm asking your CPA numbers argument. I'm asking a math question.
the math question is totally driven by, do I have to continue to apportion sales tax? My legal counsel told me when that question was posed to me in July that I had to continue to apportion sales tax until the project plan amendments were approved.
When I
And
asked
I
you
have
4
to-
weeks ago, you told me yes in City Hall in a meeting.
I
That
told you yes to what?
that it would be, that we wouldn't have to do the increment anymore because if we reduce
not say that. I said that
8.75
the-
of cultural facility projects, that we would have hit the threshold.
I said that reducing the amount of authorized projects by $8 million would reduce the gap to what we had on hand. But that does not address the question about would there be outstanding obligations for additional projects that we have already authorized that we would have to continue to apportion sales tax to meet. So, yes, that isn't a CPA question, that's
It's
a
a
legal
math
question.
question.
But the fact is that my legal counsel has told me that I have to continue to apportion sales tax until we either have enough available funds on hand to meet all of the authorized projects, or we have a legally agreed to settlement that this is the projects that we have agreed to
So is
authorize.
what you understand to be true, are you saying that a lawsuit, no matter what, enjoins that account?
Yes, until
Okay,
there,
so if any one
until
of
the-
these citizens want to sue for bringing the Norman Forward projects into a settlement, and they go sue, is that going to enjoin the account? Does it matter who the person is that's suing?
I would rely on the advice of legal counsel, but in the case of the TIF, where we do in fact have legal contracts that,
And restricted
But-
sales tax accounts, like the Norman Forward account?
Ms. Walker, would you like to address Councilmember Patron's
Sure.
inquiry?
Sure. So what Anthony and I have talked about is the increment continues until either the TIF ordinance is amended in such a way that we don't need the full 54.725 million. So that could be, as of July 1, based on the amendments that are before council on Tuesday. It could be October if a minor amendment was taken. However, if we do something unilaterally that ends up getting us sued by the developer, I don't know that an injunction is certain, but it's possible. And so if that were to happen and those funds were frozen, then we would hold those aside in our TIF account and they could not be available for other general fund expenditures or any other costs.
Okay.
Okay. Any more questions from council? If you don't mind, I would like to kind of recap what, on item 2, kind of some of the bottom line things that I took away, and correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like, we're moving forward, we're trying to end the TIF, we're trying to get our sales tax dollars back into our general fund so that we can balance the budget that we passed in July of 2019. So moving forward next week, if it doesn't pass, if we do not end the TIF, then we are looking at
If it does
budget,
pass, you
excuse
don't
me,
end the TIF.
budget reductions.
You're wrong.
Please let me
Just
finish
do.
so I don't lose my train of thought.
said correct you
So,
if you're wrong.
okay, let me finish my train of thought. Okay, so thank you. Moving forward, if we do not end the TIF, then we will be looking at these potential budget reductions. However, we could give the green light for the hospital land, correct? And that is a potential of $5 million, as Councilmember Wilson brought up, correct? Okay. 5.08 million dollars. And then we also have a rainy day fund, but I believe from our discussions in the spring, most of council agreed that we did not want to use the rainy day funds at that time to fund our budget that we were looking at, which is why we took this step. And I believe many of us were there. And that's the discussion that we had, was using the rainy day fund to fill some of the hole. But that's why we took this action to begin negotiations with our partners on ending the increment in the University North Park area to fill that gap. So we have the potential of $5 million. However, that would only put a Band-Aid on 1 year, and then it would expire in the December of 2020. However, like Councilmember Holman brought up, if for some reason there was some massive flooding event or anything else, we wouldn't have the funds available to do anything with it. So I'm not much of a risk taker, but that's what I heard. If that is correct, that's correct. Okay, so that's the position that we're in. We can either move forward and get our sales tax dollars back, or we can look at the potential of getting sued if there was some sort of unilateral project plan change. And then, so my final question for you guys, and then I'll come back to you, Councilmember Patron, is what are the ramifications, just bottom line, of not ending the TIF next week?
Okay, so I want to first address this semantic question about ending the TIF.
The verbiage.
As opposed, the verbiage of ending the TIF as opposed to stopping the apportionment of sales tax.
Yes.
Regardless of whatever project changes you may do, if the proposal to just take out the cultural facility authorization, thereby reducing the amount of authorized projects by 8.75 million, if that passes, there is still $16 million worth of authorized projects to be done. So the TIF is not ended by that action. Again, the TIF, in my opinion, is not ended until all of the authorized projects have been completed. So regardless of the action that is taken on Tuesday, the question before council is stopping the apportionment of sales tax.
Thank you for
That
clearing
is
that
what
up.
balances the budget.
Perfect.
And that's what needs to happen.
So stopping the tax increment, balancing the budget, stopping the apportionment. Okay, thank you for clearing that up. So the ramifications to the budget would be not balancing our budget.
Yes.
That's pretty clear, and that's why we're having this discussion. And then, Ms. Walker, if you would kind of discuss, some of the changes that we're making to the plan as negotiated that you've been working on for months, and what the ramifications are of not following through.
So, you all have probably heard the presentation 100 times at this point, but the cuts or the changes in the plan, we had an 8 million thereabout delta between what we thought we'd have collected by June 30th, 2019 and what was authorized under the project plan. And so the goal all along was to close that gap so that the increment could end June 30th per council's direction. And so the way that we did that was we lowered the amount of cultural facility cost from 8.75 million to 5 million, a little over 5, and renamed that cultural facility, recreation facility cost for the Norman Forward project supplements. We put in some money for traffic and roadway. We lowered the amount for economic development considerably based on one of the other parties' willingness to purchase the property, some of the property the NEDC owns. And then we reduced the lifestyle center authorization from 8.25 million to a little over, or right at 5 million rather. And so in doing all of that, we were able to meet the goal of making the project costs match what was collected through June 30th or anticipated to be collected, inclusive of the 2019 property tax assessments. The consequences of not closing out the TIF on Tuesday in a cooperative fashion it's the same as when we talked about this probably a year ago, which is we risk a potential lawsuit, and we've talked about that in executive session. If that were to happen, the funds could be frozen by a court. We could have damages to pay, maybe not, maybe we would win. We just don't know, and so that creates a risk. If we do not pass the project plan amendments on Tuesday and the project plan continues, there is no legal issue with that if we continue with the project plan as currently in place. The issue is the budget issue that you all are struggling with. I sent to you a letter right after I received it this afternoon. Wish I'd gotten it earlier this morning so you would have had time to read it, but from the developers, and that will be a public document, that talks about their efforts through these last 10 months and kind of how they view it. If you're interested in looking at that, I emailed that to you.
Can you summarize that for us real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, I read read it too.
It's 3 pages, so it's hard to summarize, but they spend a considerable amount of time going over, these last 10 months. You know, they recognize the general fund shortfalls we were facing and were willing to come to the table and negotiate. It was approved, we had an MOU approved by council in March. We had a term sheet approved by council in June, and they very much are ready to move forward with those amendments based on what was already agreed to. If that were to change, you know, I don't think they would sell land to us for the cultural facility. That's in the letter for what is a recreation facility. I think if council attempted to unilaterally terminate or redirect the TIF increment without working on mutually approved changes to the development agreements, then they will consider such action a breach of the city's obligations under the original plan and the associated agreements, and will pursue all appropriate legal and equitable remedies.
Does that mean, like
sorry.
in horse doctor terms, that we'll get sued?
Councilmember Patron?
Okay, so that I understand, because I wasn't on council in the spring, so, what did we spend and this is, Kate's question too, that she sent, I don't know who about these, but, what did we spend the recovered TIF sales tax revenue on in this year's budget? In other words, did we budget to expend 4 million more than last year? And if so, what has been spent?
We spent it on everything that we're spending money on the general fund, so street maintenance, park maintenance, public transit, everything that's in the general fund, that just became part of the general fund revenue.
So it wasn't 4 million more this year?
It was 4 million that became part of the budget. That was.
And what was it spent on?
Park maintenance, street maintenance, public transportation, everything that is in the general fund, that became part of the general fund revenues.
So it was just a deposit in the checkbook of $4 million.
That filled last year's budget.
But there's not any, like, well, we were gonna maybe hire this person, or it just everything got $4 million more expensive?
No. There was a budget hole last year.
Okay,
Okay.
okay, and then you used rainy day funds to plug that?
No, you used the TIF money that got deposited last year became a general fund revenue to
Okay.
pay for all of the general fund expenses.
Okay,
Councilmember.
then,
Car- are you-
can I have a few questions, is that
Okay,
okay?
yeah, go ahead.
It's really just delayed it.
Okay, and then, under this, can the increment, since you just said that we're in fact not ending the TIF, can the increment be reactivated again by a simple majority of council?
That would
Under the Local Development Act, can the TIF be?
require a project plan amendment.
Mhm.
And so it would have to go through the process outlined in the Local Development Act. It would
Mhm.
go, if it was more than a 5% increase, it would go to the statutory TIF committee, go through that review process to planning commission, 2 public hearings before council, and council, if they adopted something in line with the statutory review committee, could pass that the majority vote.
So a simple majority vote could turn the increment back on. What would happen if the developers told us that if you don't turn it back on, we're gonna sue you? You better pass this project plan, and if you don't, we're gonna sue you.
Is that addressed to me?
To the budget, yeah.
Based on the prior legal advice that I have gotten, I would have to continue to apportion sales tax until that settlement has been, whatever the settlement is. And
So
again,
we're gonna have to start
from
putting
the-
money aside in the hopes that we
We
win.
will have to continue to, we'd be back to where we are, the status quo. And the status quo is that we are apportioning sales tax. And regardless of how the legal case plays out, the issue for the budget is the time that we
Okay.
have to continue to apportion sales tax. And that's the $3.5 million hole in this fiscal year's budget that we would have to address.
Okay, so,
Could you clarify your question? Are you asking, so if we pass this and then the developer came to us after we passed this and said they want us to start reapportioning? And they would sue us. So, but according to the plan that we pass next week,
I'm not talking, I'm
you'd have
saying,
to come back.
let's go 2 weeks down. Let's pretend it passes and the increment stops, but we know that by simple majority, it could be turned back on. So what if they say, you know what, we'd like more money increment coming in. So if you don't turn it back on by a simple majority of 5 votes,
What would they be able to sue us for in that case?
The
I
agreement,
think that's a question I have now. But
That's
no
what
one
I'm-
seems to care that there's not a cause of action. So I'm asking if they can say, you're gonna turn it back on.
the agreement before council on Tuesday expressly releases the city from all liability related to the agreements thus far. So unless we were in breach of a future agreement at some point in the future, then I don't think they could sue us for these previous agreements. We will have that release of liability.
Yeah, no, I agree there. I don't think that they could sue, especially individual council members. I'm asking if they have you over a barrel one way or the other, whether the cause of action is legitimate or not. Who's to say that they wouldn't just say, turn it back on?
She's saying that
Here's
They
a new
could-
project plan, pass it.
they could ask, but they can't just sue us. They could ask. I
Clearly
mean, they
they
can't,
can't.
according to the plan.
Only for already,
Okay.
But our,
But-
our,
only for
Excuse me.
already agreed upon projects,
right,
which, so it couldn't be a new project because we would have had to already agree to it.
yeah, that's the difference.
Okay.
That's the whole
Councilmember,
point.
And then,
telling
and
you
then we would
unless-
have to break that agreement for them to sue us.
No, you have to pass it.
Councilmember Carter.
That's, no.
Anthony, for the benefit of council members that weren't here during the budgeting process, isn't it, as I recall, the choice was we had a $4 million deficit, and we were presented this list, basically, of cuts that could be, we had the option of making these cuts, or we had the option of ending the TIF. And the council chose to end the TIF, and we passed the budget unanimously.
That's
Is that
correct,
correct?
with the syntax correction of ending the sales tax apportion.
Yeah, the sales tax apportionment, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Very careful with our verbiage.
Um,
Councilmember Wilson.
Well, for the people that don't have this list out there, I would like to point out that there are a lot of items on here that are not people related. So just for you guys' benefit, there are, the yellow, am I correct? Is
The yellow
people?
are the personnel related, yes.
People related. So there's a bunch of stuff that's not people related.
And the pink, actually.
Pink too. Oh,
Well, yeah.
well, I can get you a copy
I look
afterwards.
into.
Councilmember, are you ready, Patron? And then I'll come to you, Carter. No. Unless, are you good?
No, I do have more, but go ahead if you want to
Okay,
ask.
Councilmember Carter.
Would it be proper, Mr. Pyle, to request this be posted on the city's website?
It is a public document as of this moment, absolutely.
And
we will
also
it.
post the letter that we got today from UNPUTC as well, so that everyone can see it?
All public documents.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
asking. And then Councilmember Hall, do you have a question?
Yes, I just need an explanation as to these categories where there's question marks and no dollar amount attached.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, the amount that would be saved by implementing those items is undetermined. For example, there's a proposal to implement a hard hiring freeze, okay?
Okay.
The savings that would accrue would be based on those positions that don't get filled and the amount of time that they remain unfilled. So you really can't, you can make some assumptions like we make when we do the employee turnover savings assumption in the budget, but the amount of the difference between what we already assume we're gonna save and what we might save from an actual hard hiring freeze is undetermined.
And Councilmember Hall, just to highlight, if you didn't participate in that part of the budget development process,
No, I didn't.
it is usual and customary when times are rosy that if council has allocated 900 positions generically, that we would budget 900 positions. Some agencies would budget all 900 positions at the top of the salary schedule. Obviously, not every employee is at the top of the salary schedule, and you wind up with some savings that council could utilize in the event of an emergency or a new project happens mid-year. My understanding is that during this budget development process, when there was a hole, the request was, let's figure out what our annual turnover is and make an estimate of how much budget we would save by trying to fine tune that line to historical averages to say we're going to have 6% employee vacancies throughout the year. Let's include those savings as part of the budget solution that was adopted by council. And that's a measure you take when you're really looking at a whole. So that doesn't happen in every budget development situation, but that did take place in the development of this budget. So a lot of those savings were calculated and included as part of the solution.
This column is the one
Yep.
that's really
So
important.
that is an extreme measure when you're really facing a big hole.
Okay. Councilmember Patron, did you have another question?
Yeah, I do.
Yes, but you just
Okay,
really would
so,
have to double that because you're already half the year's expired.
I appreciate what you just said to her, and I would follow up on that first before I have a different question.
Go ahead.
While it's fresh in my mind. So, on this, basically, you're saying that you would be filling the budget hole via attrition.
Yes, and I think the budget hole that was filled with this adoption assumed the attrition already.
Okay, which line items are that?
On the general fund summary, and the only thing that I would caution council about and maybe correct the city manager on is that we do that every year. We make that assumption every year. So
Okay.
this year, the assumption for salary turnover savings was $800,000.
And that's on this?
No, that's
well, what
in
are
your
these that-
adopted budget.
All right, so in the, like, there are question marks next to, the annual amount is a question mark, but then it comes up to 2.8 million. Centralized copier leases to achieve better terms for bulk leasing.
Yeah, again, throughout the city, there are various departments that have individual copiers that they are leasing. This proposal was saying that, centralize that. And instead of having all of these individual copier leases, have one master lease for the whole city, and you might save $20,000, but we don't know how much that savings would be. And so that's why that's,
So the 2 million is just the carryover from the line above
Yeah.
and what the running total of
yeah,
savings
the
would
far
be.
right number is a running total, as it says
Okay.
at the top.
The left one is the one we have
The
to.
left number
make
is the
cuts with.
individual item.
On the left, if we
Okay.
know.
Unknown.
That's why
So-
the
There
jobs
we
are
know that.
part of this.
Reduce PD supervisory and administrative levels, 7 admin techs, multiple majors, 2 crime analysts, and a public information officer. We don't know what those would cost, but
Well, because when that was proposed, they don't know what they would implement. But again, the police department has multiple layers of supervision that most departments don't. So what would happen is they would review that. And do we need to have all of these majors, or do we need to have, all of these captains, and perhaps reduce some of those levels of supervision? But the amount is undetermined because it's undetermined what would actually be done. But again, council's directions would be, yeah, look at that. And then the city manager would be charged to
Well, who came
actually
up with
implement
these?
that.
All the
Are
departments.
the departments.
so like the police administrations sent that in?
Yes.
Reduce our staff by supervisory and administrative levels, reduce 7 administrative techs.
Correct.
So is that their way of saying that they don't need those positions?
That's their way of saying in order to balance the budget, and where that is an impressive statement to be made by your administrative staff and PD, to say we are part of this team and we would pare our budget down to try to preserve the highest level of service possible, recognizing we need to be part of the solution to fill the hole. So a lot of public safety agencies would tell you, well, we think those cuts need to happen elsewhere because public safety is your highest priority. We probably don't need to participate. Your public safety department stepped up to the plate.
Well, have we given our now chief an opportunity to update this?
Yes, he has reviewed this before it was finalized by the finance director this afternoon, so he recognizes that still exists.
If I could give an example, in the police department, and I'll cite records, which is part of admin in this particular case. What they would do, if they're part of the game and they have to take some cuts, instead of being open 7 to 7, manning the thing throughout that time, they may be cut back to 8 to 5 or 10 to 2 or whatever, to whatever it takes to adequately staff at a reduced level. And that, the ramifications of that, of course, is if somebody's car is impounded, they may have to wait an extra day to be able to get it, which costs them more money. But it's just a matter of where you take the cuts, and that's an example of how they might take those cuts.
That's
Okay,
But that's
so,
not a given, it remains to be seen.
so I'm just trying to see what other directors, let's see. And I know you'll post this, but I'm just wondering if every department was asked to put these people in as to who that they would cut, or if that was just like, hey, if you've got some, throw them in the pot.
It was more of how would you save money? And again, because the general fund is 80% personnel cost, most departments had to submit potential personnel reductions to meet a salary to meet a cost saving goal.
Well, for me personally, I mean, I can tell you that I would much rather sell a hospital that we're not going to ever have a hospital there, and save our employees. But that's just me. It doesn't seem like it's necessary anyway, based on the other things that we've been talking about. But I do want to talk about Norman Ford for a second. I would really hope that before everybody runs off and says, let's go vote for this thing, that we know now, as of yesterday, for sure, that the multi-sport facility and the pool are at least, at a minimum, 10 million under budget. And they will not be, right now, it's not going to be a regional draw. It's going to be a 25-meter pool. They need a 50-meter pool to be able to bring in tournaments. That's the minimum, 31 million. The way that this is allocated under this settlement right now, the vast majority of it is not going to our Norman Ford projects. If we were to be able to sit down and talk with them, like I've asked many, many times, I think both parties could walk away very happy in how this thing comes to a conclusion, because they want the regional draw and selling hotel rooms and the land to go bananas with development. We want that for them as well, but we really want Norman Ford projects that we can be proud of. We want to right side the Norman Ford budget, because according to this document, they can come back and get as much as they want. Well, Norman Ford's already $3 million upside down. So I'm not really excited about being put in a position where I have to say, sorry softball, sorry baseball, sorry every other Norman Ford project, senior center, everybody else. We're under contract now that they get the regional draw. So the Norman Ford account gets enjoined, if you will, with the TIF. So I think that before anybody would run off and say, yeah, let's pass this, especially when we haven't hit the emergency trigger button that you're talking about, we're not upside down right at the moment, that the parties would be given the chance to come up with an amicable solution that does great things for Norman Ford and great things for the UNP with the money that's in the UNP TIF account. Because right now, neither party is going to end up with what they want. They're not going to end up with regional draw projects, and they're not going to end up with Norman Ford projects that our kids can go to and play basketball and become expert swimmers and all of that. They're still going to have to travel to other cities for their tournaments. They're not going to be traveling to Norman. And that's really unfortunate, because if people's egos weren't such that they won't leave their corners, we have a real opportunity here with $17 million sitting in a fund to really hit a place where everybody could be happy.
Thank you, Councilmember Patron, and
You're
thank you,
welcome.
Councilmember Carter, for your patience. Go ahead.
Well, I think, when this whole question, for the benefit of the new council members, I want to share what my thoughts were back in April or May, whenever we did this. Look here under the yellow, is eliminate 2 animal welfare tech positions. And it's not very many years ago, they had a staff where it was a half-time position to clean all the kennels. And we had virtually, they were doing a great job, but the result of that was that we had what I consider to be an unreasonably high euthanasia rate of adoptable animals. We had cleanliness and disease type issues, and by funding the Animal Welfare Center at the level that we have currently, we've been able to change that train totally around. And we've got, if not the highest, one of the highest adoption rates. You know, we're virtually a no-kill facility now. It's something that we're really, really proud of. And so, you know, these were just hard choices. You know, do we want to go back in time? It's just like you're saying with the, you know, there's not going to be the personnel to staff the shelter, the number of hours so that people can come and adopt animals. You know, they're just going to have to cut back. And it was a really tough decision where you had to weigh, you know, what your inner mantra is, you know, and this was more important to me than trying to take an agreement that had a $17 million economic development package and throw down that it had to go down to 0. Was I willing to risk that? You know, well, we got it to 5, which I thought was a great job. And so I just want to ask Ms. Walker real quick that I wanted to propose an amendment to what Councilmember Patron was alluding to, which was to ask the developers, when we were in this ask the developers if they'll sit down and talk to us stage again, was to take the $5 million in economic development for the town center and use it for Norman Forward. You know, and I think we've got a pretty good answer. I think verbally you shared that with us, and then in this letter today that the answer is no. You know, that they don't want to sit down. You know, they have spent 10 months negotiating an agreement. Is that correct? They feel like they've done their good faith part, and we just need to decide yes or no and move on.
In the letter, did they say whether or not they're okay with half a pool?
You
No
know,
tournaments, no motel rooms.
I'm sure they're very aware of
Or
what
Ms. Walker?
is paid
No, it
for,
was for Joe.
but I mean,
His question was
I
for
don't
Ms.
know. I
Walker.
just glanced at it, but then what you just said sounds like we're going to get sued, and they want to move forward with the current agreement. Can you recap that again for me? What this letter said?
Sure, the letter, you know, talks through the negotiations, of course, the last 10 months, and then says that they are not willing to consider any more reductions in the project costs or any more negotiations, that they're ready to move forward on what was already agreed to. They are aware of the ongoing Norman Forward project discussions. And as you know, the agreement before council just requires that the city spend $22.5 million, which is its budgeted amount.
At least.
Which is what I understand from Anthony and Judd to still be the case, is that the city would be spending the
At least.
$22.5 million budgeted. We would not be dropping below that. So we would be honoring our end of the deal, but they are aware of those challenges, and they're aware of some other opportunities that may come up to help that facility get fully funded.
Does that help answer your question, Councilmember Carter?
And just one follow-up question, as I glanced through it, they alluded to like not wanting, like seemed like they were frustrated in our postponement, and that any further postponements was the deal. Did I read that right? Or the deal's off the table, or?
That's a basic
fine.
negotiating
Is that what it's saying?
tactic.
Let it be.
That we're jeopardizing the current agreement and the reduced land costs and the location for the 2 Norman Forward projects, and if we don't
And the
make up our
realization.
mind.
Right, if the amendments
Forward
that
project.
that are before council don't end up getting adopted, then we would be standing on the original project plan, which does not require the donation or the sale at a reduced price of land for a recreational facility.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember
Potentially.
Wilson?
Well, this is way off those topics, but back to the hospital. So, what was the revenue we received from the lease of that land?
It was $1 a year lease.
Okay, so that's a big deal. Okay.
Is that are you good?
Yeah.
Okay, Councilmember Hall?
Ms. Walker, this is something that I just am stuck on too, that I just don't get. And that's the reference in here to estimated to cost at least 22.5. Yet, we keep saying over and over again, we are only obligated for 22.5. So why does this say at least 22.5? I mean, that
Because it-
implies that
We're not gonna go
the situation that we're in, we already know that we do not have tournament quality facilities that can be built.
It
That-
doesn't
that's-
I'm sorry.
Anyway, I just don't, why is that in there?
It doesn't require that we spend more than 22.5. It just acknowledges that it may cost more than 22.5. They are also aware of other potential partnership opportunities, and I think it's just a recognition of that.
You can go ahead.
I just have a follow-up to that too, because we do keep discussing these potential other opportunities, and I really have invested quite a bit of time in conversation with both the multi-sports folks and the aquatic center folks. And I think what's hanging out there is definitely providing some flexibility for the multi-sports facility. But as far as I can determine, unless there's other information that I am not aware of, there is no flexibility for the aquatic center, and they will proceed to build a pool that is not tournament quality and that they're not happy with, and you can't phase a pool. So I don't understand what we have out there that can,
So if I
that?
could respond, that, when we talk about where council has discretion in terms of dollars, a sale of real property provides council with discretionary one-time money. Council could choose to fill a budget hole with that. Council could choose to make sure it's a 50-meter pool instead of a 25-meter pool. Those are options that council has. It's within your discretion. So recognition in that document that talks about a minimum of 22.5, if council determines the highest and best use of the sale of real property is to enhance the pool, to exceed the current budget, which builds us a 25-meter by 25-yard pool, council can say go forth and, bring us back the cost estimate to get to 50 meters. That's what we want. We'll bring you back that. Council can make the determination that's what we do with the money or not.
Can I
Councilmember,
add on to that real quick? The other thing I want to point out is the consultant, what's been presented so far, and it's very conceptual at this point, it does not include any construction supplement under these TIF amendments. And so that would be one way to help address that as well. They're not including that until this council adopts those amendments and what they're proposing.
Councilmember Carter?
And so the construction supplement from the TIF settlement is how much money?
2.7 million.
Okay, and Mr. Foster, would you, can you, comment on what your thoughts are about it being ready for tournaments and all these things that are being said by everyone? What do you think?
Well, that's a
And
great
how,
question.
and what would that 2 point whatever million do in terms of helping the project?
2.7 million would obviously help a lot. I don't know, it's not easy to say how far it gets us. Does it get us from 25 to 50 meters or that kind of thing? Yet, we don't know that detail yet, but we're working through that we're trying to work through that now with the group that represents the swimmers on the ad hoc group. And we had a pretty lengthy discussion again yesterday at their meeting. It's quite possible that, I don't know how this will come out yet, but it's quite possible that they end up recommending a 25-yard by 25-meter pool with a second pool to go with it, a smaller pool to go with it. I don't know that that'll be the case. What they have said, they being primarily Kent Nicholson is the swim coach, and he's a pretty well-versed person on that ad hoc group committee. The wintertime competitions are short course. They're called short course competitions, are 25-yard lengths, or 25-yard or 25-meter. I think it's 25-yard distances. And so the competitions that occur indoors typically are the short course. The extra water is more important for training, practice, and other things too. But anyway, where they were headed last night, and this is all very vague, but where they're headed last night is maybe we don't need a 50-meter pool, maybe we need a 25-yard by 25-meter pool and a second pool to go with that. And I don't know what that budget looks like. That's where we left it last night, and asked our consultants to bring back some more numbers for us with different options, different configurations for different size pools. One of those will certainly be a 50-meter pool. One will be what we've seen so far, a 25 by 25. One will be probably two 25s. So we're kind of exploring all the options now to try to figure out what works the best and is the most affordable. I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but the short answer is we're working on what the best recommendation would be, and I don't know that answer yet.
And so if I'm summarizing what you just said, coming from the swim coach, that the 25-meter pool will allow them to have their winter sports tournament schedule, which makes it something, if you want to say this is a regional draw, it's going to attract tournament people. And then that the 50 meters are for those special circumstances where they might need it for a competition, but more frequently for training.
That's my understanding.
That's your understanding, and I understand that we're not
Yeah.
we're not swim coaches, so okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Patron?
I'm happy to share the audio with you from the ad hoc committee last night, and you can listen to them, to the actual swim coaches discuss what they need.
So are you saying that what he's saying is a lie, is wrong?
Nope, I'm not at all. I'm saying that they're very clear that they want a 50-meter pool in order to attract tournaments. He's not lying. He's not a swimmer. Neither am I. No one's lying. There's a certain amount of money that it costs, and it doesn't grow on trees, and I absolutely agree with that.
I get that they want a 50-meter pool, but I think your conclusion that it eliminates the possibility of tournaments.
That's
From
not
what
my
he said.
conclusion.
So this is getting a little bit, remember, this item is
Not
about
what
the
he just
budget
said.
and possible reductions. I just want to remind, we're talking about the budget and possible reductions.
Well-
Councilmember Holman, go ahead.
What? My question wasn't for.
Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Councilmember
Okay,
Patron. and
I
then we'll
wanted to
come you.
follow up on what the city manager had spoken about
Use $2 million
with
of
the
hospital money to make the pool bigger.
Norman Ford projects and the hospital money. And so on that note, we also have, and maybe Judd could tell us which project needs it more, but we have an underfunded senior center. And we also have shade structures that are needed at Breeze, and scoreboards and bleachers so that those kids can play
Almost $3
baseball.
million from the TIF. plus
So
$2
I
from
guess
the land
if we
sale.
have
Pretty damn close.
$5 million to spend, which doesn't even get us halfway to our delta that we have on the pool. If we were to give the whole 5.08 to
2.79.
a project that has already gotten another $4.5 million,
It's from the
and everybody
TIF.
else has gotten budget cuts or started out without one at all, would it be better, Judd, to give the $5 million, in your opinion, which project
This is a total
needs it
project
more?
cost.
The senior center, or the multi-sport facility, or
It's 24 million
another
for
Norman
both.
Ford project? Or maybe
That's
Joe's
crazy.
original pitch of
It's really
entertainment
a difficult question to
money.
answer right now. We're still piecing all the
The whole
different
thing
parts
is
together and
only
opportunities.
24
There are
million
other
for
opportunities
basketball and swim,
out there that
right?
could, that may, if council chooses, could supplement these projects. I guess the way I would try to answer your question is my opinion, from what we know so far, and understand, please, we're in early stages of all the design and so forth.
Yeah,
But
and that.
from what I know
you're
right
saying
now,
with the
I would
extra
say the project
stuff.
that is
So we're 6 short.
in the most need of a supplement would be the pool.
You get 3 from the TIF,
Then
2
followed
from
by
land.
the multi-sport,
and
and
the rest
then
from
followed
training.
by the senior center. And probably the, somewhere in that mix, towards the bottom, maybe, is the adult softball project, just now getting started. I can tell you that project is gonna be short, but I have no idea how much yet. We're
And
just in the early stages.
What is the overall health of the Norman Ford account,
Defer to Anthony on that.
Anthony?
The sales tax collections are short by about 8%. And if that carries through, right now we're at about 8 million, or around 3 million. If that carries through it, at the end of Norman Ford, it'll be about 8 million.
So if we go ahead and honestly, I mean, my preference would be that all of this money goes and makes an awesome Norman Forward projects in that area. I mean, either that or give the employees a raise. But to me, if you're going to have Norman Forward projects that are supposed to create the regional draw, why wouldn't we just do that with the money instead of like saying, oh, there might be something fun that someone wants to build sometime with $5 million, or we've already put money away for Robinson Crossing, it's allocated. So it would be, again, it just really feels like we're missing out on an opportunity in this haste to actually have project plans that everybody gets their goals met.
I appreciate your questions, especially with the 5 million from the hospital, maybe going towards some of these other projects. And I am worried, you know, if that's not the case, they can't go to the projects and they'll have to fill this hole. So I am worried about that, but I love that question and that idea. Councilmember Holman?
So I interpret the part about the amount we would spend there on Norman Ford projects to mean that we're agreeing that we will not cut the voter-approved budget for those two projects.
Correct.
We will agree to spend what voters approved.
Correct.
And not less.
Right.
Like the other ones got cut.
Which ones?
The other Norman Forward projects.
We haven't approved cuts of anything.
No projects have been cut.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought there was supposed to be an indoor soccer facility at Griffin.
That wasn't our decision.
The amount of expenditure has not been cut.
So does Reeves still have 10 million?
Yes.
We haven't
So-
cut anything.
Project budgets are the same. The amount that we can afford, based on the master plan that was developed, the master plans developed were far greater than the budget would support. And so the ad hoc groups had to go through and cut back out of the master plan to get to the available budget, but the budget hasn't been reduced. It's the
So
same
there's still
amount.
10 million for Reeves available?
Yes.
And there's still a indoor soccer facility available for Griffin?
No, but that ad hoc group chose to eliminate that out of the plan, or defer it to a later date, and spend the,
Allocated.
all run together, 10 or 11, whatever the total, 11 million, I think it was, budget for that project on other improvements.
Councilmember Holman, are you still?
Is there, in the agreement, is there a date determined for when these facilities must be constructed? Otherwise, we're in breach of contract with the TIF?
Yes, and I worked closely with the timeline that was in your most recent Norman Forward update. We worked on that and added some time to that. And I don't recall the exact dates offhand. I don't have those agreements with me, but they would be, I think, under construction by the end of next year, 1st of 2021, under design, of course, now. And it fits in with the timeline that was in the recent update you all received and adopted in the implementation plan.
Thank you.
Mr. O'Leary, do we have any money from ACOG on the James Garner Avenue project?
Councilmember, we've talked in recent, I think we talked about this at the Capitol meeting. We are currently in the call for project stage with the ACOG federal funding that is due. The applications are due on December 15th. We are preparing 20 applications. We are allowed to submit 20 applications, and we're applying for 20 different projects. James Garner is one of those. And our best projections based upon ranking and rating formulas is it will rank very well.
As well as
We think
Robinson.
it will be one of the top 2 or 3 projects in the region in FY21.
As well as Robinson and Crossroads.
That would be 20. So
20.
that is our
20.
number one of the 20 applications. Robinson.
Even better.
535 is
Thank you,
a very
Mr.
top
O'Leary.
priority, and it brings about $4 million to be matched with the 1.2 in TIF funds for a $5.2 million project.
Thank you so much. And then Councilmember Holman.
Have we designed that project or done any preliminary costs? Or are we still, by your years out estimate, still in budget with the $6 million that Norman Ford budgeted for that project?
We're well into design. Of course, we've done phase 1 recently here at the intersection and a short distance north of the new library. You know, we're early on, just like Judd's projects with numbers. But we, the budget was $6 million. That's what we think the project will cost. The hope was to bring about $3 million in federal funds. Our best estimate this week is it's probably going to push into $7 million as a total project cost, and we might only bring $2 million in federal funds. So we think you might have $1 million or $1.5 million left, we hope, after we have built that project to reallocate into your Norman Forward program.
Perfect.
Not $3 million. That's our best estimate right now.
Councilmember Carter?
Yeah, that was a question I had. I mean, so when if we do get that James Garner federal money, it's not got a restriction on it legally. We could use it for a road project or traffic lights or this traffic study, all these.
You
Or
could
we
use
could
it for
use
any
it for Norman Forward, or we
Forward
could,
project.
huh?
You could use it for any Norman Forward
Or
project.
any Norman Forward. It is restricted to a Norman Forward project.
Okay.
Okay.
Great questions, guys. All right, any further questions on item 2 from council? No, good discussion. So I think we got many of our questions answered, and we can all make pretty informed decisions next Tuesday, as well as whatever happens. Anyway, so now we can come to miscellaneous comments, if people have them. I know I do. I asked on Tuesday, I don't know if you have the email that I sent you about revisiting fees to Anthony Francisco. That was, I believe there's an email between he and I. That he sent an email on the 24th of October asking about visiting fee structures, revisiting them. And so I think you all know that I've had some wacky ideas in the past about how to increase revenue for the city. I didn't mention any of that, of course, but I have had those. And so what I asked moving forward is that we visit some of these fees, or we look at raising a few of them, and he and I discussed it very briefly, but I wanted to visit it with you guys tonight since we're in the middle of negotiations with OG&E. I noticed when I was looking through the document that their franchise fee rate is at 3%, whereas OEC is at 5%. And so since we're in negotiations, I was thinking maybe that's something we could work out with them if they, would be amicable to that. I don't know what that's, kind of on that would be on our city attorney's office. If you guys would be open to that, I was gonna call you, Councilmember Patron. I felt like that was something maybe you'd be interested in as well. And then there are a couple others here, increasing licensing inspections. Mr. Francisco said that it wouldn't take staff too long to look at gain some information about how much revenue we could bring in it if we increase licensing inspections, as well as looking at how do alcohol fees compare with cannabis. I mean, you guys can read here what I wrote out, and if you'd like to discuss them, I would love to look at what this looks like for our next finance committee. Go ahead, Councilmember Wilson.
On the OG&E franchise fee, don't they pass that through? Okay, so that just goes to the customers. And then along those lines, I think that those are good suggestions.
Thank you.
I know that they have the opportunity to release those facilities, like their poles. Is there an opportunity for us to reclaim more money on that release?
We negotiate as well as we can with those, particularly in the utilities departments.
Also would get passed through to the customer though,
Well,
probably.
you mean the revenues that we get?
Well, whatever we put fees on them by.
The revenues that we get from leasing our water towers in particular go directly into the water fund.
No, I'm talking about OG&E. They release their poles to other utility companies that are in our right of way. I know that's a really
power
wacky
line, phone line hung under the power line.
Yeah.
I know that Cox used to pay $3 a pole.
Yeah, it's like,
because I used to have to audit the
$5 to
poles.
$8, I think.
Yeah,
now,
but
or
there's
something like
how
that,
many
but
poles in the city,
Yeah,
and how much revenue is that?
We have talked about that.
So I would like to just that, and then the other question I have pertaining to that, sorry, it's kind of is that don't they give us some electricity as a city in lieu of that fee?
600,000.
Not in
That's
lieu of
something
the
we-
fee, it's in addition to the
It's in
franchise
addition
fee.
to the fee. So does OEC do that same thing? I don't know.
I
We
do
don't have
not
any-
believe we get
we
free
don't
kilowatt
have
hours from
any-
EC.
Okay, all right, that's all, I just wanted to kind of point that out as we're thinking along those lines.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for, was some feedback on some of these thoughts I was having. And so do any of you have any miscellaneous comments, or are we ready to adjourn?
I do have, I mean, I would like to have more information on
yoga
the,
class.
Yeah, no, again, the direction from, the request to council was for you to give us direction on areas that you wanted us to look at. So with the responses that we had gotten previously in these, it's kind of a full plate. So in upcoming finance committee meetings, we'll prepare some responses to that. Do the legal background on what it would take to do any or all of these things. We had gotten some previous requests in the building area that's kind of already under review by the management partner study. There was some questions about the marijuana or cannabis fees in general and just kind of reviewing those. So we will be in subsequent finance committee meeting, and I'm going to say January, February, before we can prepare intelligent responses to the ones that we have. So that's our direction at this point, at least.
Thank you, Mr. Francisco.
I'm
You're
in, man,
good?
I'm
Okay, and
done.
then
I wanna go
we'll
to yoga.
Well, so she's next, Councilmember.
go ahead.
For sure.
My illusion is
You can go
I
ahead.
think you just misunderstood or.
Yoga cowboy.
So I was gonna ask, the room,
gotta
board,
hit this
hotel fees, that goes into the hotel room fund?
Yes.
And I was trying to look up that ordinance. Our iPads don't go back. Like, there's not,
It's, if you look
Ballot
on
language.
municode.com, you can find our code, our entire code.
Our charter is on.
It's in Article 8.
What are you trying to find when it passed?
so I know it passed in like the 70s or something.
May of 1980.
Yeah, so, I wanted to read the ballot language and the ordinance that we have that's going along with it, because obviously it's changed over time. And what the ballot language required of that, because some of these that are going back to the 70s and 80s, maybe we need to rescind those back to the voters. Because there's no, I mean, if you look at what you just gave us with revenue, well, sales tax might be down, room and board sure's doing well, and that's not even accessible for the taxpayers.
The room
to
tax
get
is
an
actually,
advantage off it.
flat.
Said it was
we-
up 3.46% or something?
We hope to, where we're losing room tax revenue to the room sharing sites, we hope to bring that in. Now, there has been remember that the voters approved an increase to the room tax rate in 2013, but there hasn't been any change to the ordinance. Says that the revenues are to be set aside and used exclusively for the purpose of encouraging, promoting, and fostering the convention and tourism development of the city of Norman. Uses in park development and in promotion of arts and humanities are thus contemplated. And that hasn't changed since 1980.
And that's the only, city legal, that's the only stipulation on how that money should be spent?
From the ballot language, we do have contracts in place that call for a 3% administrative fee taken off the top to cover the accounting of those funds, and then 50% to Visit Norman, 25% to Parks and Rec, and 25% to the Norman Arts Council.
Okay, I would like to look at, that's one I would really like to look at,
I can send you all
on
this.
what we can do as a committee about that.
What you'd like to look at what we use it for or the rate?
The future of it. Both. All of the above, sir.
And then Councilmember Wilson?
Mine's quick. Connection fees, I think I sent to you, that's what I wanna look at. But, as far as the hospital sale of the land, what do we need to do as a council?
We'll have
What's the
an
next action?
action item for you on your next agenda, just authorizing staff to commence the negotiations with Mr. Split.
Yep.
And we would start the
That'd be
conversation
great.
at appraised value.
Any, Councilmember Cutrone, do you have another?
Well, I was just gonna ask too, on, when we meet about this, you talked about things go into the water fund, if it's a rent off of our water tower or something?
Yes.
What is available to council for bills off the water fund?
When you say what is available, remember, you're the trustees of the water utility as well. So for any purpose related to the water utility, it's totally at your discretion.
Okay, well, how is renting the water tower?
Could it be for sewage maintenance and stormwater and things
I
like
think we're
that?
talking about like cell phones attached to the water tower.
Yeah, I don't understand
We
how,
could-
why that
we
would
could-
need to go to the water fund.
It's just
Because the
an
water
asset is
utility
owned.
owns the asset, yeah.
Okay. Any further questions from council or miscellaneous comments?
The ratepayers paid to build the water tower, I mean, you know.
Okay, great job tonight, everybody. Good night. Adjourn.